When I was starting out making music, I definitely didn't have that much money. In fact, I didn't really have much of anything. Especially with sample libraries and software, there wasn't a whole lot of affordable options out there, and hardly any free stuff. But what I did have was a lot of time, and a fair amount of creativity, and some knowledge of composition and programming, so I had the challenge of getting good results with limited resources. These days, there are so many more sample libraries from even more developers than even just 10 years ago, and also a lot of free stuff. So in this episode, I want to put myself back in time a bit, and see how it would feel like starting out today, with today's technology, but the same old empty pockets. So, I thought I'd try a little experiment. I want to write a piece of music using only free sample libraries. As we're on the Virtual Orchestration channel, I mostly went on the hunt for orchestral samples. There's actually quite a lot of stuff out there. Lots of sample developers have free instruments, and on top of that, anything your fellow composers are making and giving away, and tons of audio sample packs available too. Not to mention anything that comes free along with your DAW. So I went on the hunt to download anything that I could find from the sample developers out there for free. The first thing that inspired me was the Layers library, a free set of orchestral ensembles by Orchestral tools that mostly features big ensemble chord patches. Leaning into what the library does best, I found that the first thing I did was play chords with the chords. You've got a combination of woodwinds playing sus4 chords, so it's really organ-like as we get all of these additional unintentional harmonies. This is a nice texture to start off with, but I need to add some stuff to it. Nearly all orchestral music relies on the string section more than anything else. They're the bread and butter of the orchestra, so I found a few more patches here. Along with the wind chords, I've got another texture of a chord in the strings playing multiple articulations at the same time, and on top of that, a high wavering string note, as well as a long choir note from the Orchestral Tools Sign Factory library, Manifold. It's a really cool patch where the singers are doing intervals of a fifth at random points, and to weave it into the same fabric as the strings, I've added a reverb to it using the free Valhalla DSP Supermassive plugin. We're still very textural. I've got cool sounds, but nothing with an identity for this piece yet, nothing with my own notes. I still want it to be a bit string focused here, so I'm adding some more free string libraries. I've got another string spurs patch which has some swells on the top line, and below that the rest of my strings are on a Sordino patch from the Project Sam Free Orchestra. And I've used the low strings from the Orchestral Tools Layers library underneath. They're nearly always full string patches and not individual sections, and so things get painted with a bigger brush. This is similar for free choir patches too, although they're not usually quite as realistic compared to the strings. They're a bit more pad-like. So I've used them like that. Choir filling out the harmony in the middle, and then the strings are around that. Free percussion samples are a bit more scarce, but what's out there is really good. I wanted to have something a bit more cinematic in a later part of the track, so I've stacked up some drums, toms and timpani hits. These all come from the Orchestral Tools Sign Factory too, from the Dynamo and Gearbox libraries. These percussion samples sound really cool, but one issue we run into here is that they only have one sonic perspective. One big limitation of using free samples is that we don't have mic precision control and we don't have the ability to create the necessary different sonic perspectives. This is the case for most free samples, and as a result we find that the sonic perspectives of different free libraries are not going to match perfectly. While my strings and choir are distant, the percussion is right in front of our face. For some stuff this would be cool, but here I need them to sit back a bit. And this is fairly easy to achieve. So let's tweak the percussion a bit. I've got a tiny bit of EQ on the low end here, as the first thing in my chain, and the output of that EQ is taming the volume a bit. Then I've got a compressor in place with a quick attack. That takes a bit of the transient off of the drum hits, and then there's a quick release to let the body and room through, which helps the percussion to not sound quite as immediate. And then lastly, there's a bit of reverb coming from the send here, just to a normal digital hall reverb. Listen to what it sounds like with and without the effects. I've also dug up some orchestral percussion, which always helps glue the arrangement together, with bass drums and cymbals at the important moments. This is the part of the piece where I'm going for a full orchestral sound, and this is where the Sam-free orchestra comes in handy again, as it has some great orchestral percussion patches. These cymbals and so on are being sent into a fair amount of reverb, to get them a bit further back so that they really wash over everything. Reverb is going to be really necessary to get a bit of control back into the sound here. A good example of this is the harp that I've found, which is just the stock Logic harp. Without reverb, we'd usually hear it and think that it's not much good to us. But send this harp to the same reverb that I'm using for everything else, and adding reverb here is like I'm using a completely different sample library. I'm not doing anything sophisticated with my glissandos here, but they bring the whole thing to life. And with everything else in context, these glisses give a really believable symphonic impression. So it turns out you can actually get quite a lot done with the free stuff. And while you don't always have total control of how to realise every idea in your head, if you carefully pick sounds and commit them to what they're best at doing, then the result is pretty good. The best advice I can give you is to listen to the sound carefully and then lean into it. This means that you have to find out if you actually need that sound and then use it at what it's best at doing. The main decision here is, do I need that sound for my piece or not? And if not, then leave it out. Don't try and force or tweak the sound into something that it isn't meant to be. A really good example is this Pandora Bursts patch. It's obviously a big brass sound, and it has an almost synthy feel to it. It's in multiple octaves, and it has a big bass drum hit at higher velocities too. It's not going to work everywhere, but I'm actually going for that big sound at one point in my piece, and so I am making use of it. But if I wanted to try and use it as a softer brass patch in a more delicate section, then it wouldn't be a good fit. But what if you have an idea for a specific sound in your head, but you can't find it in any of these free libraries? One of these ways to put a bit more of your own musical stamp on your music is to actually make some sounds yourself. You can get very creative with synths or sound design, and you can sample your own instruments too. I'm going to use some things here that I've created over the years on various projects. One of my favourites that I actually made while I was still a student is this really cool patch which I've just called the slowed piano. I sampled some piano notes and then I ran them through pulse stretch, which is an extreme time stretching algorithm. I forget how many dozens of times I slowed the samples down, but the result is a really cool pad-like granular thing where the attack of the piano takes ages to happen and then the tail goes on forever. Put that at the start with some swelling stuff that I've sampled on a contrabass clarinet, and suddenly our opening texture has something quite unique going for it. I didn't find a lot of pitch percussion in the world of free samples, so I used something that I sampled at the end of a percussion session a few years ago, called a yun lo, a Chinese cloud gong. There's a bit of synth bass from a Jupiter 8 patch that I wanted to immortalise at one point. And lastly, there's something a bit different, which I hope can give you a few ideas too. This started life as a simple metallophone that I sampled. But then I filtered it, put some delay on it, added a tremolator plugin, used a granular echo plugin called Crystallizer to get a bit of extra rhythm and detail in here, and finally I put a little plate reverb on the end of it. And so from single notes, we get a really cool texture that could have actually got quite a bit more mileage in this track. My overall experience of creating music with free samples was surprisingly good, as the quality of everything out there these days is actually very good. The biggest limitation was not always having complete control over the instruments to realise my musical ideas, and get things from here into here. Something really cool I've realised from doing this experiment is that back then, I did have more time to work on things than I do now as a professional, and that these days I have more resources, but I have to get things done in way less time. The limitations of free libraries having fewer articulations, fewer dynamic layers, limited mix options and so on will mean spending tons of time getting them to sound right, especially if you're combining totally different sounding libraries from different sample developers. Despite how good these sound, I've had to lean into the free samples a bit in this composition, and they do limit the ideas that I'm capable of realising. It's pretty clear that I'm not going to be able to rely only on the free stuff on a day-to-day basis, and I'm not trying to mislead you into thinking that a free library is doing the same job as a well-made library that costs a bit of money. But even so, it's still a really great thing that there are so many free libraries out there. Different developers have different approaches to sampling, different sonic areas that they gravitate to, and even different software approaches. So trying out free stuff is a great way of dipping your toes into the waters of different sample developers and seeing if their libraries are for you. So what do you think about my experiment? Please let me know in the comments. We're putting all of the free libraries used in this composition into the video description. And of course, if you know any really cool free samples, then please let us and everyone else know in the comments too. We'd love to hear what you're all up to. But to finish off, before I play you this track, I'm going to cheat a little bit here. I really think this piece could do with a beautiful solo line on top. And for those of you that know this channel already, you know what this means.